Mm. The dinner was already on the table when I walked through the door. That was the first sign something was wrong. My wife hadn't cooked a real meal on a Tuesday night in at least 3 years. She was standing at the counter pouring wine, still dressed from work, and she smiled at me the way someone smiles when they've already decided how a conversation is going to end. "I made your favorite," she said. "Sit down." I set my bag by the door and sat down. The chicken looked perfect. The candles were lit. I noticed she'd used the good plates, the ones we only brought out for anniversaries and Christmas. I should have trusted that feeling in my stomach, the one that told me this wasn't a celebration. My name is Daniel. I'm 51 years old. I spent 22 years building a life with a woman I believe was my partner in every sense of the word. I managed a regional construction firm, worked long hours, traveled occasionally, but I always came home. I always came home. My wife's name was Karen. She was 48, a physical therapist with her own practice, smart and driven, and I thought deeply committed to the life we had made together. We had a son, Marcus, 23, finishing his last year of graduate school in Austin. We had a house in Charlotte we'd spent a decade renovating. We had a dog, a retirement plan, and what I would have sworn on any given morning before that Tuesday was a solid and honest marriage. I had no reason to think otherwise, or so I told myself. Looking back now, there were things I filed away without examining. Small things. The way she started keeping her phone face down on the counter. The Saturday morning spin class that somehow always ran 2 hours. The way she'd started laughing a little too quickly whenever I asked about her day, filling the silence before I could ask anything else. I told myself I was being paranoid. She told me I was being paranoid. So I believed her. I sat across from her that night, cut a piece of chicken, and waited. She poured more wine than usual into her glass and took a long sip before she looked at me. "Daniel," she said, "I need to tell you something." I set my fork down. She didn't rush it. She folded her hands on the table the way she used to do in the early years, when we'd talk about the future, buying a house, having a child, all the plans we made together. She looked almost calm. That was what I remember most, how calm she looked. She told me she had been seeing someone, a man named Greg, one of the physical therapists who sublet space in her practice. She said it had started about 4 months ago. She said it wasn't serious, that it had only happened a few times, that it didn't mean anything about our marriage. And then, before I could process any of that, she said something that I have replayed in my mind almost every day since. She leaned back slightly, picked up her wine glass, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as unbothered, and she said, "I don't regret it, Daniel. I needed it. And honestly, if the situation came up again, I don't know that I'd do anything different." The room was very quiet. I looked at the candles. I looked at the good plates. I looked at my wife. I picked up my fork and finished my dinner. She watched me do it. I think she expected me to yell, or leave the table, or cry. I have a feeling she had a whole second act of that conversation prepared depending on how I reacted. She didn't get to use it. I ate my chicken, I drank my water, and when I was finished I said, "Thank you for dinner. I'm tired. I'm going to bed." She sat at that table for a long time after I went upstairs. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark with my eyes open, and I did what I have always done under pressure, which is think. I am not a man who acts from rage. I have been told this is a flaw, that I am too measured, too controlled. My wife used to call me emotionally unavailable when we argued. She said it like it was a character defect. It's possible she was right. But on that night, in that dark room, with the sound of her eventually climbing the stairs and the soft click of the guest room door, because she had the presence of mind not to get into bed next to me, that quality served me well. I thought about what she had said very carefully. She didn't regret it. She would do it again. She hadn't confessed out of guilt. She hadn't confessed because she wanted to repair something. She had confessed because she wanted me to know she wasn't sorry. There is a kind of person who does that, who uses honesty as a form of dominance, who tells you the truth not to free you both, but to establish that they operate by different rules than you do, and they want you to know it. I had married that kind of person and somehow not seen it clearly until right then. I got up at 5:30 in the morning. I showered, dressed, and went downstairs. I made coffee. I stood in the kitchen with my mug and looked out at the backyard, the deck I had built myself over 2 summers, the garden she had planted and rarely tended, The fence I had repaired 3 times in 22 years. Marcus had learned to ride his bike on that driveway. I drank my coffee. I set the mug in the sink. And I left for the office 2 hours earlier than I needed to. I did not go to the office. I drove to the other side of Charlotte, to a strip of professional buildings near the university, where a friend of a friend had an office on the 2nd floor. His name was Patrick Holloway. He was a family law attorney. We had met at a charity golf event 4 years ago, and stayed loosely in touch. I had never imagined needing him professionally. I sat in his waiting room for 11 minutes before he could see me. When I walked into his office, he stood and shook my hand, and I sat down across from his desk and I told him exactly what had happened. Patrick listened without interrupting. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, and he took notes in a small, even handwriting. When I finished, he set down his pen. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet," I said. "I'd like to understand what my options are before I start feeling anything." He nodded like that made sense to him. I appreciated that. He told me to get my financial documents in order quietly. He told me to open a separate bank account at a different institution than the one we used jointly and begin moving my direct deposit there incrementally. He told me not to change any behavior at home yet. He told me documentation would matter. Documentation would matter. Documentation of what? I asked. He looked at me steadily. Whatever you think might be useful. I drove home that evening and behaved in every way like a man still processing a difficult conversation with his wife. I was quiet. I was not cold. I made myself a sandwich, watched television, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. My wife had gone back to our bedroom by then. She asked me if I was okay. I said I was still thinking. She said we should talk when I was ready. I said, I agree. What she didn't know, what she had no reason to know, because I had never told her, and she had never thought to ask, was that 3 years earlier, after a series of small things I couldn't explain, I'd made some changes to our home security system. Nothing traumatic. A few additional cameras. Cloud backup enabled. Motion-triggered audio capture in the common areas of the house. I had told myself at the time it was for general security. That was only partly true. I went into the office the next morning and spent 2 hours going through the past several months of footage and audio. I had a second laptop I kept at work for personal use. I pulled up the cloud archive and started searching. What I found confirmed what she had told me and then expanded on it considerably. The visits to the house when I was traveling. The phone calls in the kitchen late at night after she thought I was asleep on the road. 4 months had been her estimate. The recordings suggested closer to 8. There were also 2 calls with her sister that I found particularly clarify. In one of them, recorded about 6 weeks before that dinner, my wife described our marriage as something she had outgrown. She said she felt like she was waiting for her real life to start. She said Greg understood her in ways I never had. She said, and I want to be precise here because it matters, Daniel will never leave on his own. He's too comfortable. So I'm going to have to be the one to blow it up. I sat with that for a while. I called Patrick that afternoon. I told him what I had found. He walked me through the relevant questions about admissibility and advised me to preserve everything in multiple locations. Then I called my accountant. His name was Roy, and he had been doing my personal and business taxes for 12 years. I trusted him completely. I told him I needed a full accounting of all joint assets, and I needed it discreetly, and I needed it within the next few weeks. He asked me one question. Is this what I think it is? I said yes. He said, I'll have something to you by the end of the month. I went home every evening that week and acted like a man in quiet grief. I was not performing. I was in grief, genuinely, for the marriage I had believed in. I just wasn't letting it make me irrational. Those are different things. And people who confuse them tend to end up on the wrong side of conversations like the one I was preparing for. My wife seemed satisfied that I was processing slowly. She was patient in the way that someone is patient, when they believe they are already ahead. On Thursday of that week, she suggested we see a couples counselor. I said that sounded reasonable. I asked her to find someone and send me a few options. She seemed pleased by that. I think she interpreted it as me being willing to fight for the marriage. I was not. I was documenting my cooperation. I called Marcus on a Friday evening from my car, parked in a grocery store parking lot so she wouldn't hear. This was the hardest call I have ever made. I did not tell him everything. I told him that his mother and I were having some serious problems and that things might be changing, and that none of it had anything to do with him, and that I needed him to hear it from me before anyone else. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "I will be." He said, "Do you want me to come home?" I said, "Not yet." I told him I'd call him when the time was right. He said, "I love you, Dad." I said it back. I sat in that parking lot for a few minutes after we hung up, and I let myself feel it then. The full weight of what was happening to the family we had built, and then I drove home. 2 weeks after that dinner, Roy sent me the financial summary. Patrick and I met for 2 hours going through it. We identified every joint asset, every account, the equity in the house, the value of her practice, my pension, the investment accounts. Patrick was thorough. He asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. We talked about the grounds for divorce in North Carolina and what the likely outcomes of equitable distribution would look like. I left that meeting with a clear picture. I also left with something I hadn't expected, which was a sense of calm that I hadn't felt since before that Tuesday dinner. There is something grounding about knowing exactly where you stand, even when where you stand is painful. I came home that night to find my wife on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't hear me come in. I caught the end of a sentence. Something about next weekend. Something about being free. And when she turned and saw me, her expression shifted into the one she used for me now. The careful, neutral one. "How was your day?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "How was yours?" "Good," she said. "I found a couples counselor. She has availability next Tuesday." "Send me the address," I said. "I'll be there." I made myself dinner that evening and ate alone at the kitchen table while she worked in her office. The dog came and sat at my feet. I gave him the last piece of bread from my plate and scratched his ears. I had made a decision about the dog. He was staying with me. That was not negotiable. The morning I chose to tell her was a Saturday, 3.5 weeks after the dinner. I had everything in order. I had transferred enough to my personal account that I was no longer financially exposed. I had a copy of every document Patrick had asked for. I had backups of the audio and video on 3 separate devices and 1 cloud location that she had no access to. She came downstairs in her robe and started the coffee maker, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my hands folded, and she took one look at me and something shifted in her face. She knew. Or she sensed it. She stood by the counter with her arms crossed. "I've spoken with a divorce attorney," I said. "I have a meeting with him next week to begin the formal process. I wanted you to hear it from me directly." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Daniel, we agreed to try counseling." "You suggested counseling," I said. "I didn't agree to anything. I said I'd show up." I showed up. She set down her coffee mug. "This is a reaction. You're not thinking clearly." "I've been thinking clearly for 3.5 weeks," I said. "I've had documentation of the full timeline of your relationship with Greg since week 1. I have recorded conversations from this house going back 8 months. I know what you said to your sister about our marriage. I know what your plan was." The color changed in her face. "You told me you don't regret it and you'd do it again," I said. "I took you at your word. I have no interest in building a marriage with someone who considers that an acceptable position, so I'm not going to." She started to say something about the recordings, about privacy, about how I had no right. I let her go for about 30 seconds. Then I said, "Patrick Holloway is handling my side of this. Please have your attorney contact him directly. I'd prefer we keep things civil for Marcus's sake." She went upstairs. I heard her on the phone within minutes. Her sister, I assumed, or Greg. I finished my coffee, leashed the dog, and walked for about 40 minutes through the neighborhood. The morning was cool and clear. The kind of autumn morning in Charlotte that makes you feel like things are possible. I thought about the deck I had built, and whether I would miss this house, and decided I probably would, and also that it didn't matter. The divorce took 9 months. It was not entirely civil, despite my preference. She hired an attorney who specialized in making things difficult, and there were several months where Patrick and I earned our patience. Her relationship with Greg ended about 6 weeks into the process, which I was told about through Marcus and received without commentary. She tried, twice, to make the recordings a central issue. Patrick handled it. It was not a central issue. The house sold in the spring. We divided the proceeds, according to the settlement, which was fair in the way that settlements are fair, which is to say nobody was entirely happy, which is probably as close to fair as these things get. I took the dog. That had been in writing since the second meeting with Patrick. She had pushed back on almost everything else, and let that one go without a fight, which told me something. I rented an apartment on the east side of Charlotte for the first year, near a park where I could walk in the mornings. I went back to work. I called Marcus every Sunday. He came to visit in November, and we drove out to the mountains for a weekend, just the two of us and the dog, and stayed at a place in Asheville he had found online. We hiked for 2 days and ate at good restaurants, and talked about his life in Austin, his program, his friends, a woman he was seeing who he was careful and hopeful about, and the way that you are at 23. On the last night he said, "You seem okay, Dad, like actually okay." I thought about that for a moment. I am, I said. And I meant it. I am 51 years old. I spent 22 years old. I spent 22 years in a marriage to a woman who decided, somewhere along the way, that I was a comfortable fixture in her life rather than a partner in it. She was wrong about a lot of things regarding me, but she was right that I would never have left on my own. I would have stayed. I would have worked at it. I would have kept building the deck and fixing the fence and showing up. What I have learned in the years since that Tuesday dinner is that showing up is only half of it. The other half is being seen clearly by the person you're showing up for. And I was not. I wake up now without the particular weight that I didn't fully recognize as weight until it was gone. The apartment is smaller than the house. The mornings are quieter. The dog sleeps at the foot of the bed and raises his head when I get up before dawn. And we walk in the early dark before the rest of the neighborhood is awake. I am not a man who is destroyed by this. I am a man who has shown very clearly and rather efficiently which foundation was solid and which was not. And I'd built on the solid one. I think about what she said sometimes, that she would have done it again, that she needed it, that she had outgrown us. I hope she found whatever she was looking for. I mean that without bitterness, which surprises me a little. But I know this much. She didn't take anything from me that I can't rebuild. She thought she knew exactly who I was and exactly how I would respond. She had 22 years of data, and she still got me completely wrong. That part, if I'm honest, gives me a quiet kind of satisfaction. Not because she lost, but because, in the end, so did the version of me who would have stayed and called it loyalty. The real version walked out into a cool morning with his dog and his dignity and didn't look back.